In this video, we'll learn the core concepts of the provider and configuration that you can use to explore the setup of Microsoft Dynamics 365 Intelligent Order Management. With Microsoft Dynamics 365 Intelligent Order Management, we understand as a business you have the choice of what software you might want to use and the partners you collaborate with. And so therefore we wanted to provide a concept that you can use to connect different systems together with the Intelligent Order Management solutions, and that's called our provider concept. So we can use providers to connect to different order channels like e-commerce systems, EDI providers, CRM systems, fulfillment providers like warehouse, 3PL systems, point of sale systems, and freight providers. And these provide that underlying connectivity to connect to systems. So if we look at this in the concept of a flow, we can take orders from many different providers, from many different systems, bring them in, trigger the orchestration, and likewise communicate out to external systems for fulfillment and delivery. Let's have a look at this in a bit more detail. Let's first talk about the main concepts of a provider. So a provider is a definition which you'll find in the catalog Intelligent Order Management. And then once you activate a provider, you'll have provider instances. So within the provider definition, we have a concept of a Power Automate that represents the relative actions and events that that provider can do. Those actions are, for example, calling an API on another service and triggering a certain event in Intelligent Order Management. Those are done through a connector, which is a Power Automate connector. Within that connector, we have credentials. Credentials provide the security mechanism to talk to that API or service, for example, an API token. Now, when we move data from an API into Intelligent Order Management or send data to an external service, we may need to transform that data, so we have a transformation concept. As we mentioned, there might be event handlers. We might have business events that can be raised by the actions from a provider, and then we can use those in the orchestration process. Lastly, we might have parameters. For example, a certain provider might need configuration to get it started. Once we activate a provider, we can have instances of it, and this allows us to have different configuration. For example, we might have an e-commerce store, but I have two different instances of that e-commerce store, one for the US, one for Canada, one for Europe. So we can configure a provider many times and use the different parameters to configure how that e-commerce store interaction happens. Let's have a look at some of these concepts within the application. In the application, I can navigate down to providers and I can see my catalog. This will give me an overview of the provider definitions. Let's use the BigCommerce as an example. If I go and add a provider, I'll have to read the terms and conditions and accept those. Now what we'll see is those concepts that we talked about. So we have events, actions, parameters, and transformations. And the connections. So firstly, let's have a look at our connections. If we click on the link and we need to configure the connections, we're going to go across to Power Automate or Flow, and we'll see our connections. So in the connections list, I have my BigCommerce connector here, and when I configured it, provide the API access token, and that's the security on that connection that'll be used. So when I connect, I can use that connection to communicate to that service. Now I might need one or many connections in a specific provider. It depends who created the provider. There may be many different services that can be used to communicate to that different system. Now we'll see the events that might be available on that provider, and we'll see actions. And then additionally, we'll see parameters. So in this example, the BigCommerce store, I would need to put in my store number to represent the parameter when I activate this particular provider for that instance that I'm configuring. And then lastly, we have transformation. So in this example, we have orders coming in from BigCommerce as a sales order, and then we'll transform them into the Dataverse sales order. Now we'll have a look at transformations in a deeper video, but essentially this is the mapping that can be used in Power Query to transform that external order into the Dataverse order. Additionally, we'll see another transformation for the order status back to BigCommerce when we need to communicate, for example, a fulfillment status back to BigCommerce. Now, if I was to activate this, if I put in all of these parameters, that would give me an instance of the BigCommerce provider. Now, I've already done that, so let's have a look at the instance, and we can see that by the installed. And so in this case, we have one BigCommerce instance configured, but if I've configured it for many different stores, for example, my US store, my Canadian store, or my European store, I could see many different instances in this list. So let's have a look at this configured instance. So if we go across, as we saw before on the definition, we saw the events, the action. So in this example, update BigCommerce sales order status. These actions are what we'll see in the orchestration flows in a minute. Now, we'll also see the parameters, in this example, my store number that I'm using with this particular instance, and then the transformations as we saw before. Now, we talked about different actions, and so we'll see here, for example, action types. These are essentially a classification, a type of action, and then we'll see the specific actions listed by what we have installed. And in this example, we have the BigCommerce connector or provider configured, and so therefore we've got the actions here. Now this correlates to the orchestration flows. So let's have a look. We'll create a new orchestration flow, and we'll have a look at the types. So based on the action types, we'll have an action that you can put on the orchestration. In this example, we've got an update order status in which we can send information back to BigCommerce. So if I select this action, then the associated tile is linked to the action types, and that's associated with the actions on that provider. So in this example, if we have a look at the provider actions, then we have one configured, which is the update the BigCommerce sales order status. So that's the connection between the provider instance configured and the flow. So essentially the actions that are available on that provider is now available to be used in an orchestration flow, so you can communicate backwards and forwards between systems based on what you need in your orchestration flow. Let's have a look at these concepts in an overall system interaction data flow. So if we have an external e-commerce or order source that can send us an order based on that provider actions, it can trigger an event which can be used in the orchestration. The orchestration can trigger another event which would trigger an action, for example, to send this order to a fulfillment warehouse logistics provider to ship that order. We can then get status information back from that logistics provider, which can raise another event through that provider action, and in which we can use the orchestration to raise another event and call that provider action to send, for example, that status back out to that e-commerce. So the overall provider concept of the actions allow us to orchestrate the communication between the different services that we might have in our environment. And this is the core concept of intelligent order management with providers, because we could have many different providers for order sources, fulfillment logistics, delivery, and therefore we can bring them all together in the orchestration to drive the overall business process that you need to configure in your environment. Dynamics 365 Intelligent Order Management is a new application in the family of Dynamics 365 applications, built on the Microsoft Power Platform running on the Microsoft Azure Cloud. To learn more about Dynamics 365 Intelligent Order Management, visit our community site, documentation site, marketing site, or our blog at these links.